The morning the Duke of Ashworth arrived at Pemberton Manor to choose a bride, 6 daughters awaited him in the drawing room, their positions meticulously orchestrated by their mother like a military maneuver. Charlotte, the eldest, strategically positioned by the window for the most flattering light, wore a pale rose silk gown, tailored twice for this very occasion. Behind her, Harriet and Louisa occupied the settee, a picture of understated elegance in matching blue muslin, careful not to outshine their elder sister. Victoria stood by the pianoforte, her fingers poised on the lid, ready to perform should the moment arise. Jane, the youngest at 16, perched on a footstool near the fire, a presence rather than a focal point. Her mother believed in showcasing the full spectrum of her daughter's talents, even when the youngest was not yet formally presented. And then there was Margaret. Margaret, at 24, was the 4th daughter. Her life had been a quiet space between Victoria's musical prowess and Jane's youthful charm, lacking a defining quality of her own. She wasn't unattractive. Her features were regular, her eyes a steady dark, her hair a sensible brown, rather than striking. She played the pianoforte passably, danced competently, and engaged in conversation that was intelligent but forgettable. She moved through rooms with a composure that some mistook for shyness, others for dullness, or a blend of both, depending on their disposition. She had been placed by the bookcase at the far end of the room, clad in a dove-gray dress, an ensemble her mother had deemed too unremarkable for the Duke's attention. The dress was 2 seasons old, fitting perfectly because Margaret's form remained constant, a trait her mother saw as a drawback, while Margaret found it a convenience. Her instructions were simple: be present, be pleasant, and above all, do not distract from Charlotte. Instructions Margaret could have followed in her sleep. She was engrossed in a volume of Gibbon, borrowed from her father's library, holding it at an angle that allowed her to read without appearing to neglect her surroundings. This was a posture she had perfected years ago, the stance of a woman who had accepted her invisibility and decided to make productive use of it. The Duke of Ashworth was not what any of them had envisioned. 31, tall, with dark hair cut shorter than fashion dictated, his face was handsome in the way of competence, structured, clear, and decidedly not dismissible. He entered the drawing room with the restrained energy of a man unaccustomed to social niceties, yet understanding their necessity. Beside him was his mother, the Dowager Duchess, 63, whose reputation for blunt honesty was either refreshing or terrifying, depending on one's position. Mrs. Pemberton greeted them. Charlotte was presented first, her curtsy exquisite, her smile radiant, her remark on the weather perfectly calibrated to be charming without being forward. Harriet and Louisa followed, their curtsies a synchronized display of practiced grace. Victoria offered a technically flawless, emotionally precise piano piece. Jane, 16 and aware of her age, curtsied with the wide-eyed sweetness of a girl who enjoyed the attention, even if she wasn't the one being chosen. The Duke observed it all with polite, attentive neutrality, his thoughts unreadable. Then, his gaze drifted to the far end of the room. Margaret, lost in Gibbon's discourse on the decline of Roman provincial governance, did not notice his scrutiny. She had reached a particularly engrossing passage, momentarily forgetting her audience. "And who is this?" the Duke inquired. Mrs. Pemberton's smile tightened perceptibly. "That is Margaret," she replied. "My 4th. Margaret, put the book down." Margaret looked up, closing the volume with her finger marking the page. She rose and curtsied. It was a competent curtsy, neither striking nor awkward, the practiced gesture of a woman who had performed it at gatherings for 7 seasons without ever being the reason for their existence. "What are you reading?" the Duke asked. "Gibbon," Margaret replied. "The 3rd volume. Which part?" "The provincial administration under Diocletian, though I believe Gibbon is too lenient on the reforms. The tax restructuring was efficient, certainly, but it impoverished the provinces, a fact he conveniently glosses over." A profound silence fell over the room. Charlotte's smile froze. Mrs. Pemberton's fingers tightened on her chair. The Dowager Duchess, standing behind her son, tilted her head, a subtle avian inclination that suggested keen interest. "I believe you are correct," the Duke stated. He does gloss over it, though admittedly, the sources for provincial taxation in that period are limited. "They are," Margaret conceded, "but that warrants caution, not optimism." He chose to interpret the gaps in evidence as confirmation of success, a recurring habit of his. The Duke regarded her for a long moment, before saying, "Would you care to walk with me in the garden, Mrs. Pemberton?" Mrs. Pemberton opened her mouth, intending to redirect him to Charlotte, to perform the maternal duty of steering the Duke toward the intended daughter. But the Dowager Duchess gently placed a hand on her arm and murmured, "Let them go." They walked in the garden for 45 minutes. The first 10 were devoted to Gibbon, the Duke posing questions, Margaret providing answers, neither noticing they had passed the rose garden and the ornamental fountain, heading instead towards the kitchen garden, a part of the estate Mrs. Pemberton had certainly not envisioned for ducal admiration. The next 10 were spent discussing the Ashworth estate. The Duke mentioned his orchards, and Margaret, recalling a grafting pamphlet, remarked upon it. He stopped walking, turned to face her, and asked, "You have read agricultural pamphlets?" "I have read most things," she replied. "There is precious little else to occupy oneself in this house when one is the 4th daughter, and no one is watching." He looked at her then, not with pity or amusement, but with recognition, the profound recognition of one who understood the experience of being present yet unseen. The remaining 25 minutes were filled with conversations far removed from Rome or orchards, the sound of the winter river rushing high enough to touch the willow roots, the particular shade of the Derbyshire sky in October, and the question of whether one could read too much. Margaret maintained it was impossible, the Duke, that it was not. This marked their first disagreement, and Margaret discovered that disagreeing with the Duke of Ashworth was one of the most delightful experiences of her life, as he countered with evidence, not authority, a novelty from a man of his station. Upon their return, the Duke thanked Mrs. Pemberton for her hospitality, bid farewell to the 6 daughters, and departed with his mother. Before their carriage had even cleared the drive, Charlotte burst into tears, and Mrs. Pemberton informed Margaret she had mortally embarrassed the family by discussing Roman tax policy with a duke. Margaret retreated to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, opened Gibbon to her marked page, and for approximately 15 minutes thought of nothing else. It was longer than she expected and shorter than she wished. The proposal arrived 3 days later, addressed to Mr. Pemberton. It was brief, formal, and requested Margaret's hand. The house fell into a silence that descends when the unforeseen happens, when everyone is recalculating. Charlotte remained speechless for 2 days. Harriet and Louisa exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations wordlessly. Victoria played the pianoforte with a ferocity that suggested a tempest of unnameable emotions. Jane, at 16, blessedly honest, declared, "I think it's wonderful. Margaret deserves something wonderful." Mrs. Pemberton sat with Margaret in the morning room, her voice laced with the bewildered carefulness of a mother who loved all her children but possessed a clear vision of their destinies. "I do not understand it." "I know," Margaret replied. "Charlotte is more beautiful. Victoria is more accomplished. Even Harriet has better conversation." "I know, Mama. What did you discuss in the garden?" "Gibbon, the drainage of the Ashworth estate, whether Plutarch is more reliable than Livy, and the best method for grafting apple trees." Mrs. Pemberton stared. "Apple trees?" "He has an orchard at Ashworth that is not producing," Margaret explained. "I suggested a grafting technique I read about in a pamphlet from the Royal Horticultural Society." "Margaret, he is a duke." "I am aware he is a duke, Mamma. He is also a man with a failing orchard, and I happen to know something useful about it." Margaret accepted the proposal. Not out of love. She was not a woman who indulged in unexamined emotions, and she had not yet had the time to examine this one. She accepted because the Duke of Ashworth had asked her a question about her reading, had listened intently to her answer, and had neither flinched nor redirected his attention to her more decorative sisters. He had listened, and in 24 years of drawing rooms, dinner tables, assemblies, and balls, no one had ever listened to Margaret Pemberton with such focused attention. They were married in September at the chapel on the Ashworth estate. The wedding, with 80 guests, was larger than Margaret would have preferred, a duke's wedding inevitably carrying social obligations. However, the Duke had consulted her on every detail, a fact Charlotte would discover later, prompting a different kind of silence from her. Margaret wore ivory silk, a high waist, long sleeves, and her mother's pearl earrings. Her hair was styled in her usual simple manner. Elaborate coiffures required an hour of stillness, while pins were fussed with, an hour Margaret deemed an unreasonable expenditure. She walked down the aisle with her father, his arm held tightly enough for her to feel his trembling hand. Just before they reached the altar, he whispered, "He is a lucky man, and I intend to tell him so at every opportunity." The Duke stood at the altar, watching her approach. His face was composed, as it always was, careful, contained, revealing nothing. But his hands, clasped behind his back, were not still. They moved subtly, thumb pressing against forefinger, a small, unconscious gesture, betraying an emotion too vast for his expression to encompass. They arrived at Ashworth that evening. The house blazed with light, candles in every window, a testament to Harding, the housekeeper, had decided without consulting anyone that the new Duchess should see the house at its best. Margaret stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the stone walls and the portraits and the grand staircase and the candlelight reflected in the polished floor, and she said, "It is very large," and the Duke said, "It is," and Margaret said, "I shall need a map," and the Duke almost smiled, and Mrs. Harding, standing 3 steps behind them, saw it. The first weeks at Ashworth were spent learning the house and the grounds and the particular rhythms of a property that had been managed competently, but without imagination, for longer than anyone cared to admit. Margaret walked every corridor, visited every room, spoke to every member of staff. She learned that the second footman's mother was ill in Cheshire and that the kitchen maid was saving for passage to visit a sister in Dublin, and that Mrs. Harding had been running the house for 16 years and had not taken a day's rest in 4. She learned these things because she asked, and she asked because she was interested, and she was interested because people had always interested her more than they realized and more than she let on. London was where the trouble began. The Duke sat in the House of Lords during the autumn session, which meant they took a house in Mayfair for October and November, and Margaret entered London society not as a debutante, but as a duchess, which was simultaneously easier and harder than either. Easier because no one could refuse to receive her. Harder because everyone who received her had already decided who she was. The whispers started within a week. She heard them the way one hears rain on a window, not every drop, but enough to know it was raining. She is the plain one. There were 5 others, and he chose the plain one. Mrs. Pemberton must be beside herself. Charlotte was right there. I heard she was reading a book when he arrived, a book in the drawing room while her sisters were being presented. The arrogance. She is perfectly pleasant, I suppose, in a quiet sort of way. Margaret heard these things and did not react to them, not because she did not feel them. She felt them the way she felt cold air or a stone in her shoe, as a discomfort that was real, but that she refused to allow to govern her movement. She had spent 24 years being overlooked. Being talked about was, in its own way, a form of visibility she had not sought and did not welcome. But she understood that it was the price of the position she now occupied, and she would pay it without complaint. She attended a tea given by Lady Forsyth in the first week of November, and sat for 90 minutes in a drawing room, where 3 women discussed the Duke's choice as though she were not present. They spoke in the third person, the Duchess this, the Duchess that. While Margaret sat 4 feet away with a cup of tea she had not been offered, but had poured for herself, because no one had thought to offer. She drank the tea. She contributed, when addressed directly, observations that were brief and intelligent, and entirely wasted on an audience that was not listening for intelligence. She left at precisely the appropriate time, thanked Lady Forsyth at the door, and walked to the carriage with the same straight-backed composure she had maintained for the entire visit. In the carriage, alone, she closed her eyes for approximately 30 seconds, and when she opened them, the moment had passed and she was herself again. The Duke heard them too. He heard them at his club, where a man he had known at Cambridge made a joke about bookish brides that 3 other men laughed at. He heard them at a dinner hosted by the Countess of Maresfield, where a woman seated across from him told another woman, not quite quietly enough, that the Duchess of Ashworth was proof that persistence outlasts beauty. He heard them from his own cousin, Lord Hadley, who said at a family luncheon, "You must tell us, Ashworth, what on earth she said about Gibbon that was more compelling than Charlotte Pemberton's face." The Duke set down his fork. He looked at his cousin, and he said, in the voice he used in the House of Lords when he wished to be heard clearly and remembered precisely, "She said that Gibbon was too generous to the reforms of Diocletian, and she was correct. And I have spent every day since that conversation grateful that I was not fool enough to choose a wife based on whether she would look well next to me at dinner, rather than whether she could hold her own across the table." Lord Hadley did not raise the subject again, but it was not enough. The whispers did not stop because a duke defended his wife at a family luncheon. They stopped, eventually, because of what happened at the Whitmore Ball. The Whitmore Ball was the last significant event of the autumn season, held at Lord Whitmore's house on Park Lane, attended by 200 people, and treated by society as a final opportunity to assess, rank, and gossip about everyone of consequence before the families dispersed to their estates for Christmas. Margaret wore a gown of deep emerald silk, not dove gray, not the muted colors of a woman trying to disappear, but emerald, chosen by the Duke, who had said without elaboration, "I would like people to see you." Margaret had looked at the dress, and then at him, and said, "They will see the dress," and he had said, "They will see the woman in it," which is the point. They arrived together. They were announced together. 200 faces turned toward the doors, and Margaret felt the weight of 200 assessments landing on her simultaneously. Her face, her figure, her dress, her hair, her posture, the way she held the Duke's arm, the way she carried herself into a room full of people who had already decided she did not belong. She carried herself the way she carried herself everywhere, straight-backed, steady-eyed, composed, not performing confidence, being composed, which was different, and which the people watching could feel even if they could not articulate it. There was something in the way Margaret Pemberton moved through a room that made people reconsider their assumptions without knowing why. She was not beautiful. She was not striking. She was present, fully, unapologetically, irreducibly present, in a way that beauty sometimes obscures and plainness sometimes permits. The Duke danced the first dance with her. This was expected. It would have been noted if he had not. But then, he danced the second dance with her, which was unusual, and the third, which was pointed. By the fourth dance, the room had begun to understand that the Duke of Ashworth was not performing a social obligation. He was making a statement. Between dances, he introduced her, not in the way that a husband introduces a wife at a ball, a name, a title, a nod, a move along. He introduced her with context. To the Lord Chancellor, he said, "My wife has a perspective on provincial taxation under Diocletian that I think would interest you. She argues that Gibbon's interpretation of the reforms is overly generous, and I believe she is right." End quote. To the Countess of Lyndhurst, he said, "Margaret has been corresponding with the Royal Horticultural Society about apple grafting. She has a method that I have implemented at Ashworth, and the results this autumn were extraordinary." To a group of 3 MPs standing by the refreshment table, he said, "If you are serious about the school reform bill, you should speak to the Duchess. She has read the proposed legislation more carefully than anyone I know, including its authors." Margaret stood beside him while he did this. She did not blush or stammer, or deflect with the practiced modesty that society expected from women who were being praised. She engaged. When the Lord Chancellor asked about Diocletian, she answered with the same quiet precision she had shown in her father's drawing room, and the Lord Chancellor listened with the expression of a man who is reassessing something he thought he already understood. When the MPs asked about the school reform bill, she outlined 3 specific weaknesses in the proposed funding mechanism, and one of the MPs took a notebook from his coat pocket and wrote something down, which Margaret noticed, and the Duke noticed, and which neither of them mentioned afterward, but both of them remembered. By the end of the evening, something had shifted, not dramatically. Society does not reverse its judgments in a single night, but the whispers changed. They did not stop, but they changed texture, the way a conversation changes when new information arrives that cannot be dismissed. She is not what I expected. She knew more about the bill than Hadley did, and Hadley sits on the committee. He looks at her differently than other men look at their wives. He looks at her as though he is watching her win something that the rest of us have not yet realized is a competition. The Dowager Duchess, who had attended the ball and had watched the entire evening from a chair near the wall, with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had known something before everyone else, said to Margaret in the carriage home, "They will talk about tonight for the rest of the season." "They will talk about the dress," Margaret said. "No," the Dowager said. "They will talk about the woman in it, just as my son intended." The months that followed confirmed what the Whitmore ball had begun. Margaret did not become London's most celebrated duchess. She did not conquer society, or win over every drawing room, or silence every whisper. She did something quieter and more lasting. She became someone who could not be ignored. At Ashworth, she oversaw the estate through the steward, a man named Harding, with the same analytical precision she brought to Gibbon and the school reform bill. The orchard produced its best yield in 11 years after the grafting. The tenant school she proposed, modeled on a pamphlet she had read about parish education in Germany, opened in March and enrolled 23 children within the first month. The drainage on the northern fields was resolved using a method she had found in an agricultural journal, which Harding implemented with the slightly stunned efficiency of a man who has been presented with a better idea than his own and is honest enough to admit it. She read voraciously and without apology. The library at Ashworth, which had been decorative under the previous Duke, became functional, reorganized, recatalogued, and expanded by 200 volumes within the first year, including a complete set of agricultural reports from the Royal Society that Margaret had written to request personally. The Duke found her there most evenings, in the chair by the east window, with a book in her lap and a pencil in her hand, and the particular expression she wore when she was thinking, focused, still, alive with the private intensity of a mind that had spent 24 years running at full capacity with no one to run alongside. He ran alongside her now, not ahead of her, not behind her, but beside her, which was the thing that Margaret had not known she wanted until she had it. He brought her problems from the House of Lords, legislation he was uncertain about, speeches he was drafting, questions of policy that he could not resolve alone. And she read them and annotated them and returned them with observations that were so precise and so useful that he once told Harding, in a moment of unguarded honesty, that his wife was the best political mind he had ever encountered. And Harding, who had been at Ashworth for 20 years and had served 2 dukes, said, "I believe you are correct, Your Grace." There was an evening in February, a cold night, the kind where the windows rattle and the fire cannot keep pace with the draught, when the Duke came into the library and found Margaret asleep in the chair by the east window. The book had slipped from her lap. The pencil was still in her hand, which had fallen against the arm of the chair, and her head had tilted to one side, and her face in sleep was different from her face in waking, softer, unguarded, without the careful composition she wore, like a second skin in every room she entered. He stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her, and in that instant he understood what he had been circling for months. yet never quite grasped. It wasn't mere gratitude he felt, nor simple admiration. He loved her. Not for her capabilities, her estate, her legislative acumen, her library, or even the woman she was when no one looked, the one asleep in a cold room, pencil in hand, a book fallen to the floor, utterly unaware of the man watching her, a man who had never anticipated feeling this way about anyone, least of all the quiet daughter by the bookcase, the one the world had subtly urged him to overlook. He gently picked up the book. He drew a blanket from the settee to cover her. He added another log to the fire, and then he left, not wanting to wake her. Some truths, he knew, didn't need to be spoken to be real. To articulate them at the wrong juncture could diminish their very essence. Their first child, a boy named Edward, after his paternal grandfather, was born the following autumn. He possessed Margaret's dark, steady eyes, the Duke's jawline, and a temperament that hinted at a future filled with strong opinions, backed by the patience to rigorously defend them. 2 years later, their daughter Alice arrived, named in honor of the Dowager, who received the tribute with the composed delight of a woman who expected nothing less and was gratified to be proven right. Alice inherited her father's vivacity and her mother's composure, along with an early fascination with the library that brought immense joy to both parents. Charlotte married the subsequent year to a viscount of modest means but considerable charm. He made her laugh and admired her beauty with the straightforward devotion of a man who knew precisely what he valued and was perfectly content with it. Charlotte and Margaret, who had never been particularly close, the kind of closeness that is often elusive when sisters find themselves vying for the same resources, now found a new kinship. It was the bond forged by sisters, no longer in competition. Charlotte visited Ashworth with her husband every Christmas. She and Margaret would walk the grounds together in the crisp air, discussing their children, their marriages, and once, the morning the Duke had arrived at Pemberton Manor and chosen the daughter no one had anticipated. I was furious, Charlotte confessed. For months, I couldn't comprehend it. I know, Margaret replied. Do you understand it now? Margaret paused, considering. I think he saw someone who wasn't trying to be seen, she offered. And he recognized that, because he himself isn't someone who tries to be seen. We were two people on the periphery, and we found each other there. That's incredibly romantic, Charlotte mused, coming from the woman who once described her engagement as a satisfactory outcome of a discussion on Roman tax policy. Margaret smiled. It was a very good conversation. Years later, when Edward was 8 and Alice was 6, the library had grown by another 300 volumes, the tenant school now educated 41 children, and the orchard yielded such an abundant harvest that Harding had begun selling the surplus at market. The Duke received an invitation to speak at a dinner hosted by the Lord Chancellor, celebrating the year's legislative triumphs. He was expected to address the Education Reform Bill, which had passed with his backing, and, in its final form, incorporated 2 of the 3 amendments Margaret had scrawled in the margins of the draft he'd brought home 18 months prior. Seated at the head of the table, surrounded by lords, MPs, and their wives, he began by discussing the bill. Then, he stopped and shifted his focus. Why AT? He posed. I was once asked, he continued, what it was about my wife that compelled me to choose her. The question was not posed kindly. It came from those who believed they already knew the answer, that I had made a mistake, that I had overlooked obvious superiority in favor of something less visible, and therefore less valuable. I wish I could say I responded with patience and grace, but truthfully, I reacted with irritation, for the question revealed far more about the interrogators than about the woman they were inquiring about. A profound stillness settled over the room. My wife was reading Gibbon when I met her, he stated. She sat by a bookcase in her father's drawing room, wearing a dress that was 2 seasons out of fashion. She was engrossed in a book about Roman provincial governance. When I sought her opinion, she offered it clearly, precisely, without the slightest concern for whether it was the answer I wished to hear. For the preceding 3 years, I had been told by every drawing room in England what I wanted to hear. She was the first person who told me what she genuinely thought. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want a woman to merely adorn my life. I wanted a woman who would challenge it. He paused. And she has challenged it every single day since. She has made this estate more productive, this household more efficient, and this man considerably, embarrassingly, irreversibly better than he was before she arrived. Every room she has graced has been improved by her presence, and I will spend the remainder of my life ensuring that every room knows it. Margaret was seated 6 chairs away. She wore emerald silk, the same shade as at the Whitmore ball, for some things become tradition not through deliberate intent, but through their inherent meaning. Her expression mirrored that of her father's drawing room, when she had looked up from Gibbon to see a man she didn't yet know, gazing at her as though he had stumbled upon something unexpected. Steady, clear, unfeigned, alive. The room erupted in applause. Margaret did not clap. She looked across the length of the table at her husband, and he met her gaze. Between them lay that particular silence shared by 2 people who need no audience to comprehend their bond, yet who do not object when the occasion calls for them to let the world witness it. Later, in the carriage, she said, "You didn't need to do that." "I know," he replied. "The bill was the subject, not me. The bill exists because of you. The amendments were yours. The research was yours. You sat at the desk in the library for 3 weeks, poring over every piece of evidence the committee had considered, identifying the gaps they had missed. You did it because you believed the bill mattered, not because you sought credit. So, I gave you the credit because someone should have, and because I am weary of rooms filled with people who do not know what I know. And what do you know?" He took her hand. "That I walked into a drawing room seeking a wife and found the finest mind in England, a mind sitting by the bookcase in a gray dress, reading Gibbon, and that every day since then has been the most fortunate accident of my life." Margaret clasped his hand. The carriage glided through the London streets, gas lamps casting shifting patterns of light across the windows. Outside, the city bustled with its own affairs, indifferent to the 2 souls within the carriage, and the immense distance they had traversed from a drawing room, where no one expected her to be noticed, to a table where everyone watched her husband stand and declare to a room full of England's most powerful men that the finest accomplishment of his life was choosing the girl no one else wanted. "If this found you tonight," he murmured, "the next one will find you too. They arrive here, like a woman on the edge of a room, whenever you look closely enough to truly notice.